Across the Shenandoah Valley, there's a stretch of fence line where the fence posts are bent outward, every single one, for almost half a mile. And nobody who lives there will tell you why, only that they replaced them once, and within a year, they bent again. That's the kind of detail Virginia holds on to. Not ghosts, not legends with neat endings, just things that happened, things that keep happening, and people who've learned to stop asking questions they don't want answered. This is a different list, different places. Same unease that's been sitting in this state for 4 centuries. We start in Highland County, the least populated county in Virginia, tucked into the Allegheny Mountains where cell service disappears and the roads fold into themselves. There's a hollow up there. Locals call it by a name that doesn't appear on any official map. Where, in the winter of 1918, an entire household of 7 people vanished between a Tuesday and a Friday. Not killed, not found dead, just gone. The fire was still smoldering in the stove. Supper was still on the table. A neighbor who came by to check on them, after seeing no smoke from the chimney for 2 days, wrote a brief account that ended up filed in the county courthouse and largely forgotten until a historian rediscovered it decades later doing unrelated research. No bodies were ever recovered. No suspects were ever named. The land was eventually absorbed into a larger farm. And the people who've worked that land since say there's a particular field, flat, unremarkable, good soil, where their cattle won't graze, no matter the season, no matter how good the grass looks. That should be the strangest entry on this list. It isn't, but we'll get to why. Travel 2 hours east, into the Piedmont, and you will find a stretch of the James River where, depending on who's mapping the area, the water runs noticeably colder than the surrounding current, a temperature anomaly that's been measured by at least one university research team studying river thermodynamics in the 1990s, who couldn't account for it through normal hydrology. The locals had a name for that stretch long before any researcher showed up with equipment. They called it the cold seam. Watermen who've fished that river their entire lives know exactly where it starts and exactly where it ends, almost to the yard, and they avoid running their lines through it after dark, not because of anything they can point to directly, but because of something they describe, almost universally, the same way, a feeling of being watched from underneath. The geological explanation is plausible: underground springs, mineral deposits, density variation. Plausible explanations exist for almost everything on this list. That's part of what makes Virginia's haunted geography so unsettling. The explanations are reasonable. The behavior of the people who live alongside these places is not. In Nelson County, in the foothills below the Blue Ridge Parkway, there's a structure that doesn't look like much from the road. A stone foundation, partially collapsed, with no roof and no walls higher than waist height. It was once a schoolhouse, built in the 1890s to serve a mountain community that no longer exists. In August 1969, Hurricane Camille tore through this exact section of Nelson County with a violence that meteorologists still study. Flash floods killed over 100 people in a single night, in a county that had no warning systems, no way to know what was coming until the mountains themselves started moving. The schoolhouse sat almost directly in the flood path. By every account, it should have been destroyed. It wasn't. The foundation held while homes around it were swept away whole, families inside them. The land itself reshaped overnight into something unrecognizable from what had been there the day before. Survivors who returned to that land afterward described something they struggled to articulate, that the schoolhouse felt different. Not damaged, different. Some refused to go near it. Others reported hearing children's voices near the foundation on quiet evenings, decades after the flood, decades after the school had any reason to have children anywhere near it. The official explanation is grief. Trauma reshaping memory, reshaping perception, turning an ordinary structure into something loaded with unprocessed loss. That's almost certainly true. It's also almost certainly not the whole story, because the people reporting these things were not the original survivors. Many of them were born after 1969, with no direct memory of the flood, describing the exact same sensation, in the exact same location, completely independent of one another. Grief doesn't usually pass down that cleanly to people who weren't there to grieve. Further south, in Pittsylvania County, there's an old tobacco warehouse on the outskirts of Danville that's been empty since the 1980s, when the tobacco economy that built half this region collapsed and took the surrounding towns down with it. Warehouses like this one are common across Southern Virginia. Brick shells left over from an industry that doesn't need them anymore, slowly being reclaimed by kudzu in time. This particular warehouse has a reputation that predates its abandonment. In the 1950s, when it was still operational, workers reported a section of the building, the northeast corner, near what used to be the grading floor, where temperatures dropped without explanation and where more than one worker quit on the spot after refusing to go back in. Management at the time dismissed it as superstition, the kind of thing that spreads through any large workforce given enough time and boredom. Then, in 1962, a fire broke out in that exact section of the building, in the middle of the night, with no clear ignition source. No one was hurt. The damage was contained to almost precisely the area workers had been avoiding for years. The official fire report listed the cause as undetermined, which is bureaucratic language for, "We don't know, and we're not going to speculate in writing." The building has sat empty since the warehouse closed permanently in 1987. Trespassers occasionally get inside, drawn by the kind of urban exploration culture that treats abandoned buildings as content opportunities. Almost all of them report the same thing about that northeast corner, without having read about it beforehand, without knowing the history. They just feel it, and they leave. There's something worth sitting with here. Across all of these places, the Hollow in Highland County, the Cold Seam in the James, the schoolhouse in Nelson County, the warehouse in Danville. The people experiencing these things are not the same people, across not the same decades, with no shared knowledge of each other's experiences. And yet the language they use to describe what they feel converges, again and again, on the same handful of sensations. Cold that isn't temperature, stillness that isn't quiet, a sense of being observed by something that isn't there. That consistency is the part that should actually concern you, more than any individual story. Isolated anecdotes are easy to dismiss. A pattern that repeats itself across unconnected counties, unconnected decades, unconnected populations, is harder to wave away as coincidence or shared cultural superstition, because the people involved often didn't share a culture at all. Highland County and Pittsylvania County are nearly 200 miles apart, separated by mountains, with almost no historical overlap in populational migration. We move now to somewhere with a name people actually recognize, Manassas, site of two major Civil War battles, ground that absorbed tens of thousands of casualties across 1861 and 1862. Most of the battlefield today is preserved as a national park, walked daily by tourists, joggers, and history enthusiasts with no incident worth mentioning. That's not where this story is. A few miles outside the official battlefield boundary, on private land that's changed hands several times since the war, there's a section of forest that local historians have long suspected contains an unmarked mass grave, soldiers buried quickly by retreating forces, never properly registered, never recovered. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 2000s found anomalies consistent with disturbed earth in a pattern too organized to be natural, but the landowner at the time declined further excavation, citing the cost and disruption to a working property. What's documented, independent of any of that, is a sustained pattern of reports from people who've hunted, hiked, or simply trespassed onto that section of land over the past several decades. The reports describe sounds, specifically, the sound of men moving in formation, boots and equipment, audible at a distance and then gone the moment anyone gets close enough to investigate. No visual sightings, no apparitions, just sound, consistent in description, collected from witnesses with no connection to each other and, in several cases, no prior knowledge that the land had any history at all. If there's a mass grave there, undiscovered, unmarked, holding men who were never properly buried, never identified, never returned to whatever families were waiting for them in 1861, then the sound isn't a mystery. It's an absence that never got resolved, sitting under topsoil, still there, still waiting on an accounting that's never going to come. That's the thread running through almost everything on this list, when you step back far enough to see it. Not malice, not vengeance, just incompleteness. Things that ended badly, or didn't end at all, in places where the land kept the evidence and the people kept the memory, passed down not through stories but through something closer to instinct, an unease inherited without anyone explaining why it should exist. The most unsettling entry on this list isn't a haunted building or strange light. It's a fact that's harder to dismiss than any ghost story, because it doesn't require believing in anything supernatural at all. Virginia has more unmarked and undocumented grave sites than almost any other state in the country. 400 years of conflict, colonial violence, slavery, the Civil War, industrial accidents, natural disasters, and ordinary deaths that simply predate modern record-keeping have left this land saturated with human remains that were never properly catalogued, never given headstones, never accounted for in any official capacity. Estimates from historical preservation groups suggest the number could run into the tens of thousands, scattered beneath farmland, forest, subdivisions, and parking lots, with no marker, no record, and no living memory of who's actually down there. You don't need to believe in ghosts to find that disturbing. You just need to understand what it means to walk across ground that's holding more dead than anyone's willing to admit, in numbers nobody has ever fully counted, in places nobody has ever fully mapped. The Cold Seam in the James River might be a thermal anomaly. The schoolhouse in Nelson County might be grief, inherited and reenacted by people too young to have earned it honestly. The warehouse in Danville might be coincidence, a fire that happened to start where rumors already lived. Every individual story on this list has a rational explanation sitting right next to it, close enough to make sense, close enough to let you sleep at night. But explanations don't make the unease go away. They just give it somewhere respectable to stand while it waits. And that hollow in Highland County, the one where 7 people disappeared in 1918, where supper sat cooling on the table and the fire kept smoldering for 2 days after everyone was already gone. That's still up there. Still unexplained. Still sitting on land that's been farmed for over a century by people who've never once let their cattle graze that one particular field, for reasons none of them can fully articulate, except to say that it doesn't feel right, and that's always been enough of a reason for the people who live closest to the ground that holds whatever Virginia hasn't finished accounting for.